It is now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today. He is an author and a workplace strategist who explores what organizations need to do to navigate uncertainty. His experience spans over 40 industries in 4 continents on how different cultures and employees interact with each other. He studies common threads of behavior in industries such as IT professionals, underground utility workers, police officers, 2 clothing retail chains. In addition, he has also worked with various Fortune 500 companies to mom and pop shops. His ideas have had it to TEDx twice, appeared in dozens of media outlets, including 2 books on human behavior, The Authentic Workplace and The Key to a New You. Currently, he lives in Dallas, Texas, as an out-of-place Californian. So let's please give a big round of applause and welcome Jeff Butler.
Right. Well, good afternoon. Coffee? Yes? No? This is like, good afternoon, yes? Okay. There is a continuing education unit for this, so I bet you guys are all hanging around there for the end of that. One of the things that is not in my bio is my family was deeply involved in real estate. They were both realtors during the California bubble, had some rental properties. Dad built a home inspection service, someone who goes under the house and checks the foundation. Then in California, there's something called a home disclosure report. And whenever there's a transaction, you have to buy this report. So my parents built one company, was sold to a large one, and then had a second one that was also bought by one, which is by a little company called American Home Shield. And then currently I'm helping my mom build the third one. So we're deeply involved in this space of real estate, and there's a lot going on this front. And when I was talking to Wade earlier, I think I'm gonna just move these off the stage because this is gonna be awkward, right? When I was talking to Wade when we were getting ready for the conference, one of the things that he mentioned was that there was, of course, a lot of uncertainty in this field, but also there was some concern about the future workforce. What's happening when there's a future change, and what are people actually going through? What does the next workforce look like? So what we'll be doing today is looking at what sort of principles do we need to handle uncertainty, but also some workforce changes that you can expect to see on the horizon. Now, for those of you who are in the crowd and thinking about technology, I like to have quizzes that sort of give people a benchmark for what's happening in the world of technology. So this slide, Marvin Minsky, also known as the co-founder at the MIT laboratory in the 1970s. This guy, genius individual, and he was known to make some pretty remarkable claims. And in 1970, he stated that humans or machines can do any work humans can do, and how long do you think it was? Do you think it was in the matter of 3 to 8 years? 10 to 20, or in the fact of 20 to 30. For those of you who think it's A, go ahead and raise your hands. What about for B? And for C? So the answer is actually A. But can you imagine someone who's so embedded in this world of artificial intelligence, technology, the go-to resource of someone in that field, yet can be so far off? In fact, we just went to the moon at that point. What about TED Talks? Many of us have probably watched these. People give educational talks on technology, education, and design. And when ChatGPT became a household name, a dinner table discussion, the founder, or one of the founders, was brought into the TED stage. And he was interviewed about what sort of roles and interactions that this new technology was going to make an impact in society. And he was quoted that he was most concerned about ChatGPT involving what part of our lives? Was he most concerned about it spreading misinformation and maybe interfering with not only local elections but international as well? Or was he most concerned about the youth, thinking, these kids need to learn how to read and write, and this tool can make essays in no time. I'm worried about the youth. Or was he most concerned about spamming Viagra emails? All right, for those of you who think A, go ahead and raise your hand. What about B? And for C? Okay, see, we got a couple for C. Fantastic. So here, I cite this specifically. You can go online if you don't believe me. He was most concerned about spreading misinformation about elections. But when this platform first came out and became publicly usable, the most common use case was people writing emails marketing Viagra. Believe it or not, that was the most common use case of ChatGPT before the founder had to shut that down. Now, we also have the area of artificial intelligence and art. And a big fear that most people have is, do you think now AI can now win art shows for cash prizes? True, false, or what is art? I know it's a little bit late in the day, but of course the answer is C in this case. Turns out that just a few years ago in Colorado, there was a state fair where a whole bunch of individuals from the public submitted their art designs. And one individual put a submission that was their name, but via a platform, Midjourney. Now, Midjourney is an interesting platform like ChatGPT where you can put in prompts, but instead of giving you text responses, it can give you images. Well, this individual created this AI image, submitted it under the Midjourney name. The judges, not knowing that this right here was generated by AI, took it as though it was done by a human. Now, which one of these do you think was the actual AI one? It's pretty evident. It's the one on the right, and that one won first place. And most people were concerned about this because they would see it and say, you know, I cannot even get that close to that artwork. It's winning cash prizes when people don't even know if it's AI. What does this mean for my job? And in the world of uncertainty, most of us are asking the question, what do I need to be, am I going to be replaced? But in reality it is, what do I need to do to become irreplaceable? And we'll talk about some of those psychological pieces that leaders are using in order to effectively navigate these changing times. Now, leadership's a very powerful principle. With it, you can do tremendously powerful things. For instance, when I get to do this wonderful work, one of the things that I'm available to do is travel to very remote places in the country. In fact, almost every year I go up to Alaska and work with their healthcare systems, sometimes their physicians. And recently we're really struggling with how do they keep their physicians in these remote areas? Because you can throw thousands and thousands of dollars, but physicians to stay in rural Alaska is extremely difficult. And what they found is no matter how much money they threw at someone, it came down to the leader's ability to embed the physicians inside of the cultural practices, inside of the community, and that created that shift between I am visiting this place to I am staying here. There had to be that jump, but it came down to the leaders playing a pragmatic role in leading to retention. So there are places that we can do to make this actual shift take place. So of course, there's many different types of shifts taking place. You have the political landscape, which does play some role in terms of the real estate area, job market, and of course, artificial intelligence. We will not touch politics too much. That's sort of a dirty topic. I'm not a politician, nor am I an economist by any stretch of the imagination, so I'll steer clear of that. But I will talk about AI, which I have a computer science degree in, and also some generational shifts. Now, when we look at technology, it's best to first understand change. What is happening? How does it take place? What sort of ways do we best fathom what's happening on the horizon? And with this one, it's really great to look at a milestone called the 50 million users milestone. Essentially, how fast do people actually acquire new technologies and adopt them into our daily lives? And as you go through a series of these new technologies, you will see airplanes sometimes take around 64 years for 50 million people to use that new technology. But as you go down the list, each newer technology taking a shorter and shorter period of time, you will see the adoption period continuously getting faster and faster till you have Facebook in just 4 years, and of course, at the very bottom, Pokemon Go in just 19 days. Just this past year, there was a new platform, not TikTok, that beat this record not just by 19 days, but in one day, over 50 million people joined that platform. Does anyone know that platform and know it's not TikTok? Anyone know that platform? Anyone know the competitor to X? Anyone heard of a platform called Threads, made by Meta? They had over 50 million people jump on to test it. They no longer have 50 million users because there's a little bit of hype. Now, when you look at these newer technologies and shifts, it's great to understand the innovation adoption curve. Essentially, how long does it take for people to actually adopt this technology to become mainstream? In this graph right here, in the very middle, that's when half the population is using something, usually when it becomes a household name. In the very front, that's called more of the fringe, the individuals who stand in front of the store to get the newest iPhone edition. And the very end, laggards, people who are the very last people to adopt new technologies. What we want to do is look at what's the new technologies are on the horizon, and then project from there. Now, a good way to get sort of an indication of this is, first off, media. Unfortunately, mainstream media has shifted from more of the middle part to a little bit behind the curve. And part of that's due to social media and there being more people being proactive about producing content. Now, why do you think mainstream media will start being behind the curve? Well, a lot of it comes down to bureaucracy. Someone who just reads the title and can produce a video in a couple of minutes can get information out a lot faster than, let's say, a media channel can. Not saying it's totally accurate, but a reproduction of content can be done in many different ways. The first one that you have, and the most immediate, is usually saw in research papers. Now, many of these go completely unnoticed, and most people never talk about them until they become a viable manifestation of a product. For instance, many of us heard of cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, all those fun things. But many people don't know that the actual algorithm, the mathematical framework for Bitcoin, for cryptocurrency, was something called blockchain, and that algorithm was actually made in 1991 as a notary system. It wasn't until it became used for a blockchain, it became cryptocurrency, a household name. Hence, no one really knew about it until it became that more mainstream point. You have areas such as in-person interactions. You're on the front lines, you see something take place, or better yet, patents. These are all on the fringe. They maybe haven't had too much use cases, but people are starting to talk about it and maybe implement one or two things. Down the road a little bit, we're talking about that other far end. I typed in the internet, old man, and this is the image that popped up. And I can't imagine like being my age and knowing like one day you'll be the #1 search result as old man. But you know, congrats to this guy. That's on the far end. And eventually you'll start seeing that there's a shift taking place where on social media, you can actually be slightly ahead of the curve. And in the middle, you have another piece, and this is a really cool technology. Have you ever noticed with, let's say, bills, politics, polls, when people are trying to get a public opinion about something, they usually would say a poll came out stating X, Y, and Z. But you fast forward a couple months and find out maybe that poll was totally geared towards whatever party published the poll. You've probably seen that all the time. What Polymarket has done is it's made a platform where you can vote on anything you can possibly want. Anything from, is Elon Musk going to tweet 1,000 times this month, to who's going to win the next election in El Salvador? And what people would do is put their money on yes versus no, and you can see a pool for how large it is and the odds. And that's actually a much better gauge of what the general public thinks, because we're more likely to vote with our dollars than we are over a random phone call at 7 o'clock at night right after dinner from some random automated message asking you for your opinion on some political thing, right? And that's been a really interesting tool in the past couple of years to get a better public idea or perception of what people think. In fact, for this room, you can even see what the public thinks of what the interest rates will do for each quarter. It's a great tool. I suggest checking it out. Again, it's called Polymarkets. And then in the middle, you have your local news. Usually a little bit faster than the large international news outlets. So that's the adoption curve. And this really leads to the fact of, with ChatGPT, most of us heard this term back in what, 2023, 2024? Does anyone know when it first came out? What year? Anyone have an idea what year ChatGPT first came out at? 2015. Almost. It's a little earlier than that, 2018. Or sorry, not 18. I missed a one there. 2018. There we go. Not 2008, 2018. And what surprises a lot of people is that ChatGPT had to go through 3 iterations before it became a household name. It took a long time before it became mainstream. It was on the fringe, yet no one was talking about it. Innovation, adoption curve. Another piece, too, is looking at things like video conferencing. Most of us started video conferencing a ton during the pandemic, and most people think that video conferencing probably took place in the past 20 years, correct? Last 20, maybe early 1990s. Yes? Anyone early the 1990s? If you look at history, the first video conferencing, here it is. What year do you think that was? 60s? 50s maybe? Try the 30s. But you think about it, video conferencing, all what you need is a telephone to call someone and a black and white television to give the feed. It turns out in Europe, this was being researched as a way that the post office can have loved ones communicate across Europe. But they had to scrap the project due to funding of World War II. It wasn't until later on when you had the 1960s where this reemerged as a way to communicate live, where you had the famous Stanford first public demo of code, and then the anchor of Zoom, Slack, all that good stuff from there. So a lot of these technologies take a long time to become mainstream. As William Gibson put it, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And your goal is to see what's happening on the edge and how can that impact what I do. Now, a big tricky part to this equation is something called the certainty paradox. And many of us heard relatives, even commercials, family, friends who say, I can pick stocks so well I can beat the S&P 500. Do you know what percent can actually beat the S&P 500? Any idea? It's not very high. It's actually 1.3%. And the problem with this is called the rational actor theory, is that we all think that people are going to act in rational ways. But has anyone heard of the whole GameStop situation or watched that movie? Of course, you get a whole bunch of people who say, hey, I don't like Wall Street. Let's try and bid up the stocks for GameStop when everyone's trying to short the stocks and, of course, driving the market into a very poor position. People sometimes do weird stuff. So our goal is look ahead, but we can't necessarily guarantee what the future will be if it goes to the mainstream point. We can just be aware of what's on the horizon. Now let's talk about the changing workforce. A big question that a lot of people have is, what's taking place on the horizon for the future generations? And here's the weird thing. With what I do, I get to go to all different kinds of industries and listen to patterns of what people are experiencing. And a big piece that I've heard quite frequently is, I can simply not find the right amount of people for my company as I could in the past. There's a shortage of talent. And I heard this from people who were in the Canadian mines, drillers there. We're getting a fraction of what we used to get. Then people who were in police forces, people in agriculture in Oklahoma, and even people who are in charge of the emergency medical services all across the US. In fact, during a conversation with the president of the individual who was in charge of the Southern California Emergency Medical Services, he said, in my 2 decades of being here, in the very beginning, we used to get 300 applicants for one role. How many applicants do you think he gets now? Well, it's less than 300, obviously. So between 0 and 300. 50, a little lower than 50. Anyone more cynical than 50 here? It's around 10. Right, oh, so you yelled out 10. There you go, perfect, nice job. 10. That's alarming. That's for people who are there when you get into a car accident and you need help. Like, these are some very important individuals, which really brought up a question that I was quite pondering a bit. Our population is going up, but why is there a shortage of talent? Very interesting. And digging into this, I realized that there were many different layers to this problem. On the first level, of course, we all heard of the gig economy being 57 million people involved, which is brand new. It's about 2 decades old. And you have things like TaskRabbit, you have Fiverr, all these kinds of platforms, but you dig into it a little deeper and you say, what's the most common gig economy job? Probably driving Lyft or Uber, right? That's only 1.5 million jobs. Now, I know a million's a lot of people, but only takes into account for less than 0.5% of the US population. So that can't be the main cause. It has to be something else. Well, maybe you pull out your phone and say, maybe it's social media. Maybe all these young, talented kids are saying, I want to be an influencer, and that's where they're getting their money. Could be. It turns out on social media, there's 61 million creators worldwide. And on TikTok in the US, there's 1 million creators. That's still like 0.5% of the US population. So that can't be it either, but it could be contributing. And then here comes the culprit. If you dig into the health of the economy, what sort of major stats do you look at? We often think of the unemployment rate as a good benchmark for how the economy is doing. But I would challenge you, instead of looking at the unemployment rate, try and look at the labor force participation rate. In fact, if you look at that, you would find out that in 1950s, about 2% of the workforce of prime age males between 25 to 54 weren't working. Now, that number's 10%. But why don't we see it? Unemployment rate, you'll say it's 3 or 4%, and we're doing pretty good. But what unemployment rate does not spot and does not track are people who are actively not looking for work. So this has spiked dramatically, so much so it's on the same level as where we were during the Great Depression. A massive jump, 10%. Now, if we look at this chart, of course, we see that during COVID, it went up to as high as 25%. Stimulus checks could be responsible for part of that, but it's still hovering around this 12 or 13% range. In the very beginning of this shift, though, what do you think caused that initial bump? In the very beginning, what do you think caused a lot of working males to not be in the workforce during the 1960s and 70s? Part of it was women came into the workforce. Now, there's a much more cohesive, both sexes working together. But over time, that still increased. As you saw the maximizations of females in the workforce, then males continue to drop. And even in industrialist countries like Japan are also seeing this concept take place. There's a great book about this called Men Without Work, and the statistician here finds these big stats in plain sight. And this was quite alarming when I first found this piece of information. There's a lot of reasons for this, and you can look more into the book of the reason why, but I wanted to show you a sort of a stat hiding in plain sight. Now, that's one piece of the pie. But let's look at the ambitions, the sort of North Star of people who are now joining the workforce. Where are they heading? And a big thing that you often would see are these poll surveys that would say to kids maybe between 11 and 17, what do you want to be when you grow up? And of course, the differences between male and female, somewhat identical. They both want to be doctors or nurses, but you will see a gamer's pretty high on the male side, and a YouTuber is a little bit higher for men as it is for women. But the crazy thing about this is from 2021. This is really old. This is ancient, because just this year there was a new one that came out that said 57% of Gen Z want to be influencers. A major jump. That's startling. Now, maybe this is a viable path, right? Hey, you don't have to play professional sports. You don't have to get concussions. This could be a good career path. So let's look at how likely it is for someone to become this influencer. What's the actual data behind it? Well, I have 3 different careers for you right here. One is a YouTuber of 1 million subscribers. The second one is an actor or actress who goes down to LA and actually makes it by able to be paid in the bills as an actor or actress. And the third one is becoming an astronaut. Those are the 3 careers that we have here. For those of you who think it's 2 out of 250 to get to becoming a YouTuber with 1 million subscribers, go ahead and raise your hand. What about an actor or actress? And what about an astronaut? Okay, we got like 2 hands raised that whole time. And then the majority were on astronaut. So I guess the 3 that raised your hands, yeah, you're right, that's astronaut. Leaving actor, actress with YouTuber. 1 out of 50, actor and actress, YouTuber, actor. The odds of becoming a YouTuber with 1 million subscribers is 1 in 3,600. Lower probability to get to the NFL if you played Pop Warner. Those are the stats. In fact, your kid has better odds becoming an astronaut. But here's the thing. Let's say it's a worthwhile, financially strong path. To get to a place of 100,000 subscribers, we're talking 1/10 of the audience here. You're like a baby influencer at this point. How much money do you think you get paid a month from YouTube? And by the way, I've been paid by YouTube to make videos, so I know a little bit of these numbers. How much money do you think you get per month from YouTube if you have 100,000 people subscribe to your channel? $5,000 a month? Any other bids besides that? 10,000? So really close, you're around 2.4 to 4K a month. That's not including sponsorships. So you're basically looking at, on the higher end, the median salary of someone in the US. Now, here's the question. What are the odds? Lower than an astronaut. That's the crazy part, and you now know who's making money in this process at the end of the day. The technology platforms. In fact, people used to make a lot more money back in the day with YouTube, but the numbers have gotten lower and lower each subsequent year. But here's where the whole weirdness comes about. If you sit down each generation and you say, how much money do you think you need to earn a good living? When you look at, let's say, the younger generations here, you have millennials, they would say, well, in order to earn enough to get by and be financially successful, $180,000. You then go over to Gen X, and they might say a little bit more. Maybe they're more realistic, a little bit more seasoned, a couple more kids, and they'll say 212. But you go to boomers, and they'll say, we got it all figured out. We only need $100,000. But here's where I just don't understand this. You ask Gen Z, and they'll say, over $500,000. You see this weird discrepancy? I want to be an influencer. I don't get that much money, but I want a lot of money. It's like, well, maybe if they work a little bit, they go into YouTube, they go into whatever, and they realize, I should have been an investment banker, right? I don't know, but here's some really odd paradoxes in this whole ambition piece. Oh, and they also said they want a net worth of 9.8 million means you're in a good spot. Right, one day. So that's more the ambitional shift. But there's also some other big places involved where we're starting to see also a psychological shift in the landscape. I gave a TED talk about 10 years ago about smartphone technology changing the way we think. And the YouTube video has close to 500,000 views right now, partly because I think a lot of people have noticed something's going awry. And if you compare, let's say, the working environment, the playground environment of, let's say, 50 years ago, we'll see some startling shifts. For instance, this one on the, let's see, it's the left-hand side. It looks very fun, exciting. Kids are flying all over the place. And on the right-hand side, it's very colorful, but there's no one out there. And a lot of attendees point out there's no one out there because they're all on their phones. That's not the point. The point here is there's a big difference. How do we go from the left to the right? I think there's some attorneys, right, that are sponsoring this event. What happens? Risk. Kid falls down, breaks his arm. Parents say, I don't want to pay for it. The school has to pay for it. They go online, better call Sal, find some attorney. They go out there, they sue the school. The school says, this is a liability. We got to make this more safe. And that happens over and over again. Yet these sort of infrastructures are what helps people, kids, understand where their physical limits start and end. With that said, we noticed a large shift too in the psychology makeup. Many of us have heard of mental health being a major concern and talked about in the workplace. And if you see a lot of these stats, you will see this skyrocket of people who tend to have depression and college students, ADHD, anxiety, depression, all these kinds of things happening. But many of you probably would sit back and say, is that because we're talking about it more? Or is there something really happening behind the scenes? Well, how do we know if this is just talk or something has shifted in the past 15 years? Well, we have to find something black and white, quantitative, physical, because in psychology, if you're feeling bad one day, girlfriend, boyfriend broke up with you, you're going to score really low on that test and say you're depressed. But how do you know if someone's actually depressed? You got to look at the actual physical actions. Two things: self-harm and suicide rates. If you track those over this period, if you also see a spike, you know something's going on. But if there's no spike, then you know people are just talking about it more and maybe more willing to say, I'm feeling blue. Does that make sense? So let's look at the actual numbers behind this. If you look at things like self-harm, hospitalizations, you will also notice a increase in boys for about 50%, but girls are almost up 200% in just the past 15 years. And suicide rates, for any of you in the medical field here, might know that suicide rates have gone up dramatically, more so in girls than boys. Yet boys tend to be much more likely to commit suicide. Uncomfortable topic, but proves the fact that there's something else going on here. So the question is, what is the culprit? What is the driving factor behind this? Well, a lot of this can be attributed to things that are in plain sight. Where is our attention being focused that it wasn't in previous years? In fact, there's some significant milestones we've seen in the past 10 years of newer technologies. But how does this play a role? Well, a lot of these technologies have led to these new breakthrough stories that have gotten international attention. One of this is the Molly Russell story. This young girl, at a point of her life, became famous in the United Kingdom for the wrong reasons. They found out in a 6-month period, Molly Russell saw 3,600 posts on Instagram of self-harm, and at the end of that, she took her life. The only way we know about that is because the parents opened up a lawsuit which allowed the people who are pursuing Meta to look inside the phone of what she was looking at before her time of leaving this world. And yet, with these kinds of things in place, we find that it's not just the US, Australia, United Kingdom going through this as well, and this strange thing of a correlation between time spent on social media and depression that came out. Very interesting. Now, to mix this equation of, yes, social media can make us feel inadequate, there's another piece that we have, unfortunately, driven ourselves into. And that is, during our lives, there are these milestones that what we go through that sort of fortify our character. Getting our first job, driving for the first time, even things like alcohol or being romantic for the first time. All of these, if you track these big pieces, I like to call them milestones of creating that confidence, independence in your life, are all being pushed out later in life. And time spent with friends, face-to-face, has actually decreased 66% in the past 10 years for individuals between the ages of 15 to 24. Now, those are some drastic milestones, but why could social media, yes, individuals are now partaking in these character building pieces much later, why would social media have such a strong role in manipulating people's behavior in a negative way? Well, there's a reason for that. And as someone who's taken artificial intelligence classes and worked at FANG companies, I can tell you there was two major factors that came into play. One we're deeply ingrained to understand where we rank socially in our environment. When you're younger, it plays a much stronger role, and it's harder to compartmentalize shifts and how drastic they are. In this case, our rank of where we are can be quantified as simply as followers. You know if you go up and if you go down. And the second piece, which was a later feature to social media, was the like function. If I post something, how liked am I by my peers? But here's where things get a little bit more Machiavellian. What if you add in a little invariable reinforcement? Sometimes you are liked, other times you're not, and have kids figure out what they'll want to do. The same patterns can be put in place for gambling. Sometimes you win, most of the times you don't. And they added that same proponent to these deep psychological drives of humans in general, but then you put it in the hands of kids, and yet for gambling, there's an age limit, but not social media. And that's why, as you might have noticed with Meta, they started adding these age requirements. But if you look into a lot of the research, they were trying to get people as early as 5 and 6 hooked on these platforms with similar psychological patterns. Not so good, but unfortunately, this is the first time we really found this out because this is brand new technology and plays a big psychological impact. I know for myself is a big one because if I post something, right, I spoke at this Oklahoma event and it's like my mom and someone's cat like my photo, I feel like I'm a loser, right? But you need to learn how to compartmentalize it, but going through that as someone who's just trying to understand who you are in the world is much more psychologically stressful. If you're curious on any of the data, The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt came out last year, brand new data covering these issues. So that's the workforce shifts, and why you might have noticed a few different things in the upcoming generation. But let's go now into the different patterns, the pieces that you can leverage in order to handle times of uncertainty. A big piece here is understanding that how you view the world, the psychological scope, determines the level of uncertainty. If you change the scope, you'll find that it becomes very certain, expand the scope, very uncertain. Here's an example of that. You can see things here that are the industry. You have then my company's environment, my department, my team's environment, my local environment, what I do day to day, and what I think. The goal is, as a leader, you might have uncertainty on these outer rings, and you need to come into a ring that has a level of certainty and build back out. As a leader, though, the struggle also becomes if you have several people on your team, and let's say we expand this further. Let's say we have different pieces of the economy and other variables, and your goal is everyone around you who's your direct report also trying to navigate what's going to happen with these new bills, new administration, these big looming questions, bringing them to the same psychological point as a team to make sure that they're not being overwhelmed by their surroundings. So the scope of which you see things can determine the level of certainty. Bring everyone in to the same level of scope. Now, once you have that, that's when you can start reinforcing and building the team in terms of a direction that you have some certainty in. And that comes down to the actual KPIs that you put in place. Different things that you track that give you a sense of control. Which brings me to the next part, which is now regaining the control in uncertainty. A great example of this is looking at individuals who went through extremely uncertain circumstances and what they did in order to effectively navigate those. In fact, this individual right here, Henry Morton Stanley, was known to be an explorer, but also a great target for protesters on campus, as someone who went inside of Africa and was one of the initial explorers who saw what those lands were all about. Now, this individual did the unthinkable. He went all the way across the Congo, a journey that took 1,000 days. He took off with 200 people and arrived with 100. And you had things not just, I don't know if anyone here has traveled to Africa, but if you do, you got to get 1 million shots because everything there basically wants to kill you in nature. But on top of that, you have the local tribes aren't too happy, so they're hunting you down. You got malaria, you got all kinds of things in the forest trying to kill you, and yet his job is to explore the area. With so many chaotic pieces in that environment, he did something that freaked out a lot of people. every day in the morning, regardless if they were being chased in the middle of a storm or they're all starving, he would whip out his razor and start shaving. Freaked everyone out. It's like, why is he shaving? What's he doing? Well, it turns out that there was a lot of research done in terms of cleanliness and self-discipline. And what they did is they took two groups of students and they had them answer questions of making financial decisions. You probably heard of the marshmallow experiment where the kids have to sit in front of the marshmallow and say, I'm not going to take it when the people leave. Well, it was a test of self-discipline. And what they found out is in a clean, organized testing room, people overall did better than a messy one. And what he did was two things here. One, when he would keep his face clean, he actually left a sense of discipline. But on top of that, you know the rings, the scopes? He went down to a scope that he can actually control, shaving. He can't control the weather, he can't control his crew, can't control if he gets malaria that day, but he can control one thing. And that brought into a level of which he can bring in that level of certainty. And this is often referred to as the locus of control. Bringing in your environment and actually having that feedback loop to, if you can do certain things in your environment that moves you towards your goal, that releases dopamine and serotonin. The same thing happens when you have a team. If you want to get promoted, if they just say, be here for 5 years, fantastic. You have someone who clocks in and clocks out for 5 years, won't really improve. But if you say you need to get these 10 things progressed in your career to get to the next point, you now have a tangible map that can make someone proactive of moving forward. So what you want to do in a time of uncertainty is giving someone, your team, yourself, something that they can tangibly change to move forward proactively in that environment. And that's where the KPIs come in place. Most people say, we got to do better. Things have to change. Okay, but you have to switch from qualitatively, which is the descriptive, better, good, to quantitatively. What is the actual quantitative measurement? And when you make that shift, you'll find that locus of control kicks in. So how do we do that? You have things like draw a circle 4 inches in diameter. That's a quantitative mark, 4 inches. Someone might refer to that as draw a large circle. You see the qualitative versus the quantitative? Problem is, what if the page is really small? Or better yet, draw a 2-inch line facing south, draw a short line, right? But what if you're at the bottom of the page? Here's the thing. You see this pattern of quantitative, qualitative, quantitative, qualitative. Then, when you have larger goals, like let's take a few here, let's say you have to close X amount of dollars. Very popular in real estate, whether you're a mortgage broker or you're someone who's a real estate agent, close this much money. If you're dealing with a salesperson and they have to close that amount of money, you can't force people to close escrow faster. You can't close more deals just magically and force people to sign things. So what can you control? What can you do for someone in sales if they're in that role? This should be pretty straightforward for this room. Right? How many people do you talk to? Eventually, based off a close rate, you can win. So you face this mark that you control, that's in their locus of control, and now lead to the outcome. What about pieces like lobbying? We got to pass this bill. A little bit different of a field. Well, maybe you can't force people to vote for you unless you know this is like the mafia, but we're not in the mafia. Spend this much time lobbying or this much dollars. You put a quantitative mark. Then, what if you have, let's say the new website you guys saw earlier, how can you increase the experience and make sure it has more people using it? Well, maybe add new features. Add 5 new features to help people work with the new website. You see how you're shifting from qualitative, quantitative, and going from outside of your control to inside of your control? When you're working with people in uncertainty, that's the shift you got to make. And that's where we start bringing into the psychological state now. Now you brought it in, helping them navigate those waters. And this really can be boiled down to basic psychology. People are going to go through rough patches, but how do you reel someone in? This is often referred to in different techniques, one of which is used such as CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, also known to help people through post-traumatic stress disorder. The concept and framework is simple. Your thoughts, behaviors, and actions are all connected. How you think determines what you do, determines how you behave. And the cool thing is, if you change the way you think, it has a ripple effect. Again, see the pattern of locus of control. And in CBT, the big thing is, as someone who's leveraging it with their team, it's spotting thought distortions. How are people contorting their environment and thinking differently in ways that might not be so beneficial? A thought distortion here, all or nothing thinking. You hear it all the time. People who say good or bad, black or white, everything looking without any gray area. Now, you could say anything less than an A+ is a failure, or the neighbor is loud, therefore they are a bad person. Solution. What's the solution to this? I'm sure many of you have seen someone who's had this all or nothing thinking. How would you help resolve this issue? Well, it's quite simple. You help them see the gray area. Has your neighbor ever left you cookies or done anything nice? Okay, so maybe they're not just bad, maybe they're just Latins and they like to party. By the way, my wife's Latin, so I get to poke fun at Latins all the time. But if any of you are familiar with psychology, they often see psychology, like things you think, as good or bad. What is the good thing about this? Would it be good if someone was thinking in a black or white way? How could that benefit someone? Well, actually, what it will do is it will increase their expectation of performance and they can make faster decisions. Sometimes you will, if you fail, it's a bad thing, like nuclear explosion bad. You can't be like in a nuclear power plant and say, gray area, doesn't matter if this overflows, we're all going to be fine. It's like, no, you're all going to die. That's not good. Black and white thinking has its place. But when it becomes adversarial to you moving forward, that's when it's a problem. What about this one? Emotional reasoning, that the way you feel defines reality. Here's an example for you. You feel enraged because because you assume they were neglectful on purpose. My glasses don't work right now. I need new prescriptions. You feel enraged with someone because you assume they were neglectful on purpose, or better yet, you feel you're lonely at the conference, so therefore you feel like no one likes you, so you befriend the coffee machine. So therefore you assume this conference, everyone's just mean here, right? Totally comes off that way. Solution, of course, is logical reasoning. Have you talked to anyone at the conference? Has anyone said anything nice? What other things that make you think that you're being neglected at the conference? But what's the benefit to this? Why would emotional reasoning be a good thing? Why would your brain actually partake in that level of distortion? How could this be beneficial to someone? If you really, what's that? Right, and if you were really so traumatized by the Oklahoma Land Title Association conference, it was traumatic for you. You can only talk to the coffee machine. Next year, you might not go again, and you know what? You might feel a little better. It seems silly, but if you think about it, your mind's basically saying, this is too traumatic, therefore, don't re-engage in this experience. Now, of course, if you're working with someone and they have emotional reasoning, at times you need to break that apart. But here's where things get a little bit tricky, and this is where sociology kicks in. What if you have two different things, such as, are you responsible then for the way someone else feels? And what if they're offended? This is where that whole world of social media and the cognitive behavioral therapy that I was reading on this intersected. Where unfortunately on social media, a lot of people would say, I am offended. And then start saying that the company, whoever they are, is responsible for the way that they feel. Yet that completely undermines these psychological frameworks. Very interesting, but just food for thought. And at this point then, oh, by the way, great book on this, Feeling Good by David Burns. These are the various thought distortions that they have there. Great to know, especially when you're working with someone who's going through a difficult piece, especially in turmoil. And then you get to fortification. You built in the framework, you wrapped it into a scope they can work with, you quantified it, the team now has the momentum. How do you then keep people on track and then coming stronger together as a team? Fortification. Creating transparency, a feedback loop. Kelvin, the individual who created the way of measuring temperature. And I cannot see this, and I don't have slides in front of me. When you cannot measure what you're speaking about, express it in numbers, you know something about it, but you cannot measure it when you cannot express it in numbers, your knowledge is of meager and unsatisfactory kind. Quantitative expectations, making something quantitative. How can we do that? Dashboards. Here's the KPIs. Here's how far we are. Whiteboard. Here's how far we are to this point. Making it transparent to the actual environment. How are we moving towards that goal? Because what happens over time is you have an individual who says, okay, we got a goal, and action happens and you get a feedback loop. We start doing things, we start moving towards it, uncertainty happens, and if it goes great, fantastic, the team feels better, it moves in a positive direction, people feel good. That's rare. What the thing we need to worry about is what if things don't go well? And as they continue to go unexpectedly worse and worse and worse, the team morale drops to eventually it just drops off the slide entirely. That's what takes place. So what you want to do is you want to avoid being someone like this dog right here, saying, hey, everything's just fine and it's burning. We've all had leaders like that. Everyone knows that we're in the wrong direction. The leader's not taking accountability, and everyone's just like, they're just disconnected. They have their future figured out. I don't. This isn't good. How then do you avoid this situation? Well, the pattern is you have people in the very beginning, which they're in the buy-in stage. Eventually, you miss a mark. You don't hit that KPI you set, and then people start to doubt it, and then after the doubt starts coming in, and this happens continuously, they start fortune telling. Another belief. This is too far. You probably heard that too. People saying, hey, these goals like way too far out. They don't know what they're talking about. And then the doubt starts coming in, boiling down to you have blame stage, disengagement. Why am I even trying here? Just completely disconnected from the goal. Loads of controls out of the equation. So how do you curb this pattern? How do you stop this from happening in your particular uncertainty? Well, the way you would is you have your performance of a team that would potentially drop. We can all talk about things working out well, but I'm concerned about when things don't go well. And what you can do is you eventually have to turn around that performance, but the feedback loop has to be very small at first. Anything small, you get the feedback on the team over and over, but, and here's the but face, you need to make sure that you have a contingency plan. A roadblock of saying, if we go down before this level, I got to step in here and change the goals or the orientation, otherwise the team just loses it. Here's an example of increasing feedback loop. Extremely political figure right now. Yes, but when he first took over Twitter, he moved into the building, increased feedback loop to change performance. Most leaders won't do that. And he even said, I'll throw the kitchen sink at it. You want to have the roadblocks, as they say. Backstops, as they would in typography. If you've gone too far, there's a road mark that you can say, oh, I'm too far, and come back. How this looks, you have your road mark in place. If your team goes below that mark, you jump in. You stop the team from that psychological pattern, you reorient it, and you shift the momentum. So you got to make sure, like before you hit all the quantitative goals, you say, okay, if it gets this bad, I'm going to step in here and address it. If you don't, the team thinks you're that dog that's a burning building that you just don't care. That's the main challenge. Those are the pieces. Workforce changes. Laws of change. Understanding your scope. Bringing the scope into a locus of control by shifting from qualitative to quantitative. Once in qualitative, then you're able to bring that transparency and fortify the team, but also watching the psychological pieces that people are going through in order to understand, do people need help going through this trying time? The rings are built on one on top of the other. Now, with that said, I want to leave you with one last idea to finish off this talk. And in the very beginning of this presentation, I mentioned the whole painting. I think you saw the whole AI piece. And that was pretty intense for most people. They're like, crap, you know? In the earlier panel, they were just talking about AI potentially, you know, being able to grade my emails and do Grammarly there, but what about actually making art? Well, that really got me wondering that with this art piece that won the Cash Show prize, what does it mean for our jobs in the future? Will we then just say AI superior to human art in the future? And then all of a sudden, all these human creations just become negligible in the past? Or will we take a different route? And that led me to a very interesting thought experiment I thought I would share with you. As many of you would probably guess, in 50 or 100 years from now, kids, grade school, will probably learn how to work with prompts and AIs pretty quickly. Maybe 5, 6 years old and know how to work with AI. And imagine that your kid goes to elementary school and their job is to put out some art, self-portrait, with an AI prompt. And they come home and they say, hey, Mom, look what I made. I made this nice piece of art. I made it for you. It's a self-portrait. And you look at it and you're like, oh, yeah, that's pretty cool. Like, there's you looking at you above you. That's pretty cool. And they said, well, Mom, we've always been working with prompts, but the teacher says they're going to do something different tomorrow. We're going to work for the first time with pencils. And then we're going to draw with the pencils. So your kid goes to school, comes back, and decides to show you what they drew. And they said, Mom, I drew you. I mean, geez, it's a whole mess, right? The hand's as big as the head. The hands are different sizes. Legs are deformed. It's a complete nightmare. But yet, you have this decision. You got these two pieces of artwork. You got one spot on the wall for them. Which one do you put in the drawer, and which one do you put on the wall? That's the interesting question. And everyone intuitively knows, even though by every stretch of the imagination, this one is worse than that one. But this captured the mindset of your child at the only time in history they'll be that age, how they viewed the world. And you almost want to capture that and put it in one place because that's where your child's mind was at, and cherish that for the next 10 to 20 years of their life. You can't capture that with AI. That's part of that human connection. And that's here to stay. So thank you so much for listening to my talk of Leading in Times of Uncertainty. I really hope that helped you out with whichever you're facing in the near future. Thank you again. Have a great rest of your conference.